399 BCE. A morning in Athens begins like any other. Pale sunlight settles onto the stone slabs of the Agora. Merchants lift their shutters. Students gather in small knots of conversation. The city hums with its usual noise, offering no sign that history is about to turn in a different direction. In a nearby prison, an elderly man sits in silence. There are no chains, no panic. Before him rests a cup of poison already prepared. He could leave. His friends have arranged everything. The law allows him to escape. Yet he does not rise. Behind this man lies an entire life, without books left behind. No school bearing his name, no written works, only conversations held in daylight in the streets among people who seemed entirely ordinary. And now, all of it is about to close in silence. The man's name is Socrates. For more than 2,000 years afterward, he would become one of the most influential figures in the history of Western thought. Not because he taught something new, but because he forced people to ask what they truly know, and what is merely habit repeated until it feels like truth. The story of Socrates begins in 5th century BCE Athens, a city at the height of its power and dangerously close to its own unraveling. It moves through years of war, political unrest, and a democracy struggling to discover its limits. It reaches its climax when he is brought to trial by the very city that raised him. And it ends not with escape, but with a choice that generations have continued to debate. Before we begin, you may take a moment to follow the channel and share your thoughts in the comments. It helps these slow and reflective historical stories reach more people. Socrates is a living paradox. He claims to know nothing, yet unsettles the confidence of the most powerful figures in Athens. He believes in the law even when the law condemns him. He spends his life asking questions only to accept in the end an answer that cannot be changed: death. Later, his students will write books. Schools of thought will emerge. Philosophy will become a tradition stretching across millennia. But Socrates leaves behind nothing except an example. An example of how to live, how to speak with others, and how to face the truth, even when it is uncomfortable. So slow down just a little. Let the noise of today fall away and walk with us along the old stone roads of Athens, where a man who never wrote a book laid the foundation for an entire philosophy. This is a gentle, sleep-friendly biography of Socrates. Chapter 1. A City Awakening. Athens in the 5th century BCE was not the largest city in Greece, but it was the loudest and the most ambitious. It lay among dry, rocky hills facing the Aegean Sea, with the port of Piraeus linking the city to trade and to the wider world. This was an independent polis where power did not rest with kings, but was shared among adult male citizens. Athens was at once a political center and a birthplace of poetry, theater, and endless arguments about how human beings should live together. Around 470 BCE, Athens was a city accustomed to people speaking before others. Not only within the family, but out in the streets, in the marketplace, and in public spaces. Here speech was never entirely private. It was bound to citizenship, to responsibility, and at times, to trouble. Athens had already passed through war and was entering a period of rare confidence. Only a few decades earlier, the Athenians and their allies had defeated the Persian Empire in decisive battles such as Salamis in 480 BCE and Plataea in 479 BCE. These victories did more than preserve the city. They convinced their people that they could choose their own path. Democracy in Athens was not an abstract idea. It was a way of living. Citizens were expected to attend assemblies, to sit on juries, to listen to long speeches, and then to offer their own judgment. Avoidance was not admired. In Athens, choosing not to participate was still a choice, but one that caused others to see you differently. At the center of this life stood the Agora. It was a marketplace, a court, and a political space all at once. People came to the Agora to buy food, but also to hear news, to meet friends, and to argue. A man might begin his morning selling olive oil and end his day standing before a crowd defending his honor in a dispute. Living in such a city, people grew used to being watched, used to know that their words could be repeated, misunderstood, or turned into evidence. Athenians understood that speaking was an essential skill, but also a danger. Not everyone who spoke would be heard, and not everything that was heard was safe. Alongside its intense political life, Athens remained a city of ritual and gods. Festivals were held regularly. Sacred days were observed. Religion was not separate from public life. It appeared in the laws and in how people judged what was acceptable and what crossed the line. Amid all of this, a child was born. Ancient sources usually record that Socrates was born around 470 BCE. Beyond this approximate date, almost nothing certain is known about his early years. There are no letters, no personal records, no direct account from Socrates himself. This silence is not unusual in the ancient world, but in Socrates' case, it would last for his entire life. We know his father's name was Sophroniscus, and his mother was Phaenarete. Beyond that, almost everything fades into uncertainty. There is no firm evidence about their occupations, and no sign that the family belonged to a wealthy or influential class. There is nothing to suggest that the child was prepared for any special role. No stories of early brilliance, no famous teachers. From what remains, Socrates began his life much like many others, growing up in a noisy city where adults spoke constantly about politics, law, war, and obligation. In Athens, children heard these conversations from an early age, not because adults set out to teach philosophy, but because city life made such awareness unavoidable. Citizen assemblies, court trials, and public debates unfolded in the open. Children were not kept apart from them. They grew up surrounded by the sound of arguments. Over time, this created a particular kind of familiarity. People became accustomed to questions being asked in front of others, accustomed to being challenged, accustomed to the fact that clear answers did not always exist. Athens did not teach people to remain silent. It taught them to be responsible for what they said. At the time of Socrates' birth, No one in Athens imagined that these habits could lead to a famous trial decades later. No one thought that stopping in the square to talk could ever be dangerous. It was simply a natural part of city life. Yet from a place so used to speaking, listening, and debating, a life would grow. A life that left no written pages behind, but was bound entirely to speech. A life whose traces would not rest in books, but in the memory of the city itself. In 470 BCE, none of this could yet be seen. Athens moved along its ordinary rhythm. The Agora remained crowded. Rituals continued. And Socrates at this point of beginning was only a name without any special meaning. His story does not open with an event, but with a city. And from that city, Socrates steps toward the square where the life of a citizen waits for him to begin. Chapter 2. Living as an Athenian citizen. Mornings in Athens began early. While the sun still hung low above the stone rooftops, the Agora was already in motion. Market stalls opened slowly. The smell of fresh bread mixed with olive oil and the sweat of porters hauling goods up from the harbor at Piraeus. The city woke not to bells, but to human voices. Socrates lived within that rhythm. He stepped out from his home and merged with the flow of people moving toward the square. There was no separate path for him. Narrow stone streets carried everyone to the same place, where news traveled faster than any messenger. Athens at that time stood at the height of its power. Tribute from the Delian League flowed into the city. Marble was hauled up to the Acropolis. Buildings rose amid the sound of hammers and chisels, white dust settling on the clothes of those passing by. The city was wealthy and it was tense. Money came with arguments. Power came with unease. For an Athenian citizen, these forces did not exist on paper. They appeared in daily life, in brief exchanges at the market, in complaints about taxes, in quiet headshakes at the mention of Sparta. Politics was not separate from ordinary routines. It lived in the streets. Socrates was present in these spaces. He stood among the crowd when a new decree was read aloud. He sat through debates that ran longer than expected. He waited for his turn in the small, ordinary duties of civic life. Athens did not allow anyone to stand aside for long, and Socrates did not try to stand apart. Assembly days often began at first light. Under an open sky, hundreds, sometimes thousands gathered. Dark cloaks, dust clinging to leather sandals. Voices were overlapping before order was briefly restored. Speeches followed, some long, some short, some stirring the crowd to noise, others sinking into silence. Socrates stood there listening as others did. He heard promises. He heard accusations. He watched how an argument could shift the crowd's mood in a single morning. Not every decision was made on solid reasoning. On some days, emotion prevailed. On others, fear took the lead. Beyond the assemblies were days that felt entirely ordinary. Hot afternoons when the Agora thinned out. Shadows stretched from the stone columns. Small groups gathered speaking without formal rules. There were no raised hands to vote, yet the arguing continued. About laws, about morality, about what had just happened in the city. Socrates lived among these conversations not as a leader, but as a presence. He grew accustomed to disagreement, accustomed to having a remark challenged at once, accustomed to the absence of clear conclusions. In Athens, arguments often ended when night fell, not when everyone agreed. War was always close at hand. Military drills were held regularly. Weapons were inspected. Shields hung inside the home. Armor was not decoration. Every citizen knew there would come a time when the city would call his name. This was not seen as a personal tragedy, but as a shared obligation. Socrates accepted this as others did. Life as an Athenian citizen did not allow one to choose only what was convenient and ignore what was heavy. To live in the city meant being ready to carry its demands, whether one wished to or not. Day after day, these experiences repeated themselves. There was no single dramatic moment, no marker to signal a sudden change. Yet within this repetition, a quiet understanding took shape. An understanding that words hold power but can also be swept along by the crowd. That laws are made by human beings and that human beings can change them. Socrates had not yet paused to question in public. He still moved in step with the city, living within shared duties, occupying the same spaces as everyone else. But Athens was there, each day, with its assemblies, its arguments, and its decisions that could turn in an instant. And it was within this ordinary civic life, amid the smell of stone dust, the sound of voices, and long, hot afternoons, that Socrates began to know very clearly the city he lived alongside. Chapter 3. The First Years at War. In the summer of 432 BCE, Athens changed its rhythm. Assemblies ran longer. News from beyond the city grew more frequent. In the narrow streets, people spoke less about trade and more about preparation. When the Peloponnesian War broke out, it did not arrive like a sudden storm. It felt like something long expected. This war was not simply a clash between two armies. It was the outcome of years of quiet rivalry between two different ways of life. Athens was a maritime city, wealthy through trade, and the tribute of its allies. Sparta was a closed, militarized society, wary of any expansion of Athenian power. As Athens' influence spread across the Aegean, that tension could no longer be contained by treaties. For the Athenians, the Peloponnesian War did not resemble a straightforward war of defense. It raised questions about power, about the city's role in the Greek world, and about the cost of maintaining that position. Decisions made in citizen assemblies now reached beyond taxes and laws. They sent the city's sons away from home into campaigns with no clear end in sight. For this reason, war quickly seeped into every part of life. It appeared in conversations at the market, in arguments over strategy, and in the fatigue that accumulated year by year. No one in Athens could treat it as the army's concern alone. It belonged to the whole city, and each citizen was drawn into it in his own way. The first days of mobilization took place on the outskirts of the city. Armor was brought out of homes. Shields were cleaned. Leather straps were checked again and again. On open ground, groups of men formed ranks, slowly growing used to moving together. The dry, even sound of metal striking metal drowned out the scattered chatter that came before. Socrates stood in those ranks like any other man. Becoming a hoplite was not a special distinction, but a part of Athenian civic life. Once the armor was on, differences of profession or status faded. What remained was a place in the formation and the responsibility to hold the line. Days of marching stretched on. Dry earth clung to sandals. Sweat soaked into the padding beneath the armor. At midday, the sun beat down on round shields, heating the metal quickly. At night, thin blankets were spread on the ground. Meals were simple and dry. Sleep came in short intervals. War at this stage did not yet take the form of decisive battles. It was waiting, moving, and holding position. Brief commands passed down the line. Discipline mattered more than sudden bursts of courage. Each man learned to match his steps to the shared rhythm. Within a hoplite formation, no one fights alone. One man's shield protects the one beside him. A single step taken out of rhythm can open a dangerous gap. For this reason, war trains people to pay attention to others, to the movement of the group, rather than to personal intention. Socrates lived within that discipline. He grew accustomed to following commands, holding his place, and enduring repetition. Days without combat were often heavier than moments of direct danger. Men waited for new orders, waited for news from other fronts, waited for a change that might never come. In these intervals of waiting, people observed one another, who remained calm as time dragged on, who was easily pulled into anxiety, who spoke often and who stayed silent. Such judgments were never written down, but they lingered in the memories of those who stood in the same ranks. For Socrates, war at this stage was an extension of civic life, differing mainly in that it pulled people away from the city. The Agora was no longer before him. Debates gave way to brief commands, yet the structure felt familiar. Listen, act, and take responsibility for one's place. When campaigns ended, soldiers returned to Athens in small groups. The city now carried a different atmosphere. News from the battlefield arrived before they did. In market conversations, war was no longer a distant possibility, but a shared experience for many. Socrates slipped back into the city's familiar rhythm after each campaign. He returned alongside others, carrying fatigue and habits formed beyond the camp. War had not yet brought fame, nor had it offered clear meaning. It had simply added a heavy and real layer of experience to life. The early years of campaigning passed in this way. No glory, no conclusions, only the repetition of discipline, waiting, and collective responsibility. Athens continued its war, and its citizens continued to answer with their presence. As the war dragged on, the city began to search for other ways to speak about itself. Not only through shields and spears, but through words, laughter, and the stage. And in a place far removed from the battlefield, the name Socrates was about to be spoken in a way no one could have anticipated. Chapter 4. When the stage called his name. In the spring of 423 BCE, Athens was more crowded than usual. Roads leading toward the theater district are filled with people. The festival of Dionysia arrived on schedule, bringing days of rest, wine, and a familiar sense of anticipation. The city set aside its daily work to watch plays. In Athens, the stage was not only for entertainment. It was where the city examined itself. The theater opened beneath the open sky. Spectators sat on tiered stone benches facing the circular stage below. A low murmur of conversation drifted through the air before the performance began. Familiar faces from across the city were present. Politicians, soldiers, merchants, farmers. They came not only to laugh, but to recognize what was unfolding around them. When Aristophanes' play, The Clouds, was performed, laughter rose quickly. The stage presented a strange, yet recognizable figure. A thin man, his mind drifting, speaking in riddles, suspended in the air, busy with peculiar questions. The character's name was spoken clearly: Socrates. Every comedy in Athens began with something the audience already knew. Laughter only followed when what appeared on stage already existed in the life of the city. Before his name appeared in the theater, Socrates was already a familiar presence in Athens. Not because he held office and not because he wrote books, but because he was often found in public places. He stopped to talk, to ask questions, and to extend conversations that others preferred to end quickly. To many, this was an odd habit. To some, it was a source of irritation. Stories about him had begun to circulate through the city, about a man who unsettled the young with questions, about someone who made those confident in their knowledge feel exposed. These stories had no fixed shape, but they were familiar enough that when a name was called on stage, the audience recognized it at once. In that moment, a name stepped out of everyday life and entered the city's collective imagination. On the stage, Socrates was no longer a citizen among others. He became a symbol of disturbance, of questions that unsettled people, of a kind of intelligence seen as detached from practical life. The audience laughed. The laughter spread without need for explanation. Comedy in Athens did not aim for subtle attacks. It exaggerated, mocked, and named its targets directly. As laughter rolled down toward the stage, it carried an unspoken agreement. An image had been planted in many minds at the same time. Socrates was in the city when this happened. He was not on the stage. He may have been seated among the spectators or heard the story later through others. Either way, the image had come into being without his participation. From that point on, the name Socrates was no longer tied only to scattered conversations in the square. What mattered was not the accuracy of the play. Aristophanes was not writing history. He was writing to provoke laughter. Yet, within that laughter, a connection was formed. For many Athenians, Socrates began to mean a type of person. Someone who asks too many questions. Someone who unsettles minds. Someone who did not fit in. Aristophanes did not choose Socrates at random. In the eyes of many Athenians at the time, he had come to represent a new kind of intellect, difficult to grasp and unsettling. An intellect not anchored in old traditions, not easily controlled, and prone to shaking what seemed self-evident. On stage, these traits were exaggerated and blended with the image of sophists and other intellectual movements that were already causing anxiety in the city. For that reason, the character Socrates in the play was more than a single individual. It was a condensation of many fears. Fear about the young, fear about speech without restraint, fear that the city was changing faster than its ability to govern itself. The stage gathered all of this into one image, easy to laugh at, but hard to forget. After the performance, Athens returned to its familiar rhythm. People left the theater and continued talking, continued arguing. But the name that had been spoken on stage did not return easily to its former place. It now carried an added layer of meaning, simpler and easier to repeat. From that moment on, when people mentioned Socrates, not everyone thought of a particular man standing in the square. Many thought of the image they had seen, an image that was humorous, an image that was irritating, an image that lingered. Socrates did not answer from the stage. He did not write a correction. He did not attempt to replace that image with another. His life continued in the city amid everyday conversations. Yet from this point forward, he was no longer entirely unknown in Athens' imagination. The play ended to applause. The festival went on. The city kept laughing. But something had changed. A name had been placed in the mouth of the crowd, and from that moment it no longer belonged solely to the man who bore it. The theater emptied in the afternoon light. Sunlight slanted across the stone seats. The audience dispersed back into the city, and Socrates from this moment entered a new phase. Not because he spoke differently, but because the city had begun to look at him with different eyes. Chapter 5. The war has not ended. By the summer of 422 BCE, the war no longer felt like a new event. It had become the familiar backdrop of Athenian life. News from the front no longer stirred the city as it once had. People listened, nodded, and returned to their work. The war no longer erupted. It endured. Marches continued to pull citizens away from the city. The routes were the same dry paths, open fields, and hastily built camps. The early excitement had faded. In its place came habit. People knew what to do, what to carry, and what to wait for. War at this stage spoke less of victory and more of endurance. Socrates put on his armor once again. He returned to the hoplite ranks, standing shoulder to shoulder with men who had marched beside him in earlier campaigns. There were no ceremonies, no stirring calls. Each man adjusted himself to the shared rhythm as they had done many times before. The Battle of Delium took place in this atmosphere. It was a confrontation without a clear outcome. Formations were disrupted. The retreat unfolded under strain. Amid dust and shouted commands, the most important thing was not to advance, but to keep the line from breaking. Later sources would note that Socrates remained calm during the withdrawal, holding his position, showing no panic. It was not heroism in a theatrical sense. It was simply the act of maintaining order when everything threatened to come apart. The war did not end there. That same year, news from Amphipolis brought further losses. Familiar names disappeared from everyday conversation. In Athens, people began to grow accustomed to counting absences. Who had not returned? Who would never return? These campaigns did not stretch on without pause. When the campaigning season ended, the armies were temporarily dismissed. Soldiers returned to the city, set aside their armor, and resumed civic life. The war continued at the level of the city, but for each individual, it arrived in waves, in summons and departures, interrupted by brief returns. Athens, during these intervals of return, carried a different tone. Less confident, less patient. The Agora remained crowded, but voices were lower. People spoke more about mistakes, about decisions made in haste, about the cost of ambitions that refused to end. On hot afternoons, when the wind carried dust and cooking smoke, conversations ended earlier than before. War slowly eroded what had once seemed solid. Concepts like courage, honor, and responsibility did not disappear, but they became harder to grasp. They no longer stood firm in speeches. They appeared in fragments, in small choices, in how people responded when exhaustion set in. Socrates carried these experiences back into the life of the city. He did not recount the battlefield as an achievement. He did not use it to assert anything. Yet what he had seen and endured did not easily leave the memory. War leaves people with a quiet caution toward words that sound too certain. In this prolonged stretch, people were forced to live with unresolved contradictions. Athens still needed speeches, still needed decisions, but faith in simple answers began to waver. The city no longer looked at the world through a single lens. Socrates returned to the Agora in this atmosphere. He brought no glory. He brought no solutions. Only an understanding of what people can hold on to and what they can lose when placed under long trial. War does not need heroes. It needs endurance. And within that quiet endurance, Athens began to move into another phase. A phase in which questions about how to live, how to decide, and how to understand oneself became harder to avoid than ever before. From here on, the city would no longer ask only for Socrates' presence as a citizen or a soldier. It would begin to listen to him in a different way, not because of victories, but because of the slow questions that emerged amid fatigue and doubt. Chapter 6. Footsteps in the Agora. Socrates had no school, no lectern, no set hours. He posted no sign, issued no invitations, and promised nothing. Yet during these years, he was often seen in the Agora. Not always in the same place, not at a fixed time. He appeared as part of the flow of people, then paused when that flow slowed. The Agora no longer sounded the way it once had. It was still crowded, still filled with vendors' calls, arguments, and the echo of footsteps on stone. But there was a new caution in the air, like a fine layer of dust settling over every conversation. People spoke often, but with less certainty. Neatly formed declarations had become rarer. Decisions once made quickly were now weighed for longer. Socrates moved through this space like someone familiar with the path. A simple cloak, worn sandals. He did not claim the center. He stood in the gaps between groups, where one exchange had just ended but not quite closed, where someone lingered as if not ready to leave. A conversation often began with something small, a remark about a court case, a comment on a council decision, an example drawn from daily life. Socrates listened before speaking. When he asked questions, they were brief and familiar. What is justice? What is courage? What does it mean to do what is right? Words. Everyone used words. Everyone assumed they understood. He did not rush the exchange forward. He asked his interlocutor to repeat what had just been said more slowly, to explain a term, to offer another example. Each time the pace slowed, spaces appeared between sentences, not an awkward silence, but a pause in which words examined themselves. People nearby began to stop, not all of them. Some laughed and walked on. Some grew irritated and turned away. The Agora allowed that. No one was forced to stay. But those who did often found that the conversation had moved in a direction they had not expected. Socrates did not claim the side of being right. When a contradiction emerged, he did not seize it to conclude. He left it there, like an object placed on a table visible to everyone. When no certain answer remained, he stopped. There was no summary, no advice. The conversation ended with an opening. At midday, the sun pressed down on the Agora. Shadows from the stone columns shrank. The smell of olive oil, sweat, and cooking smoke blended together. Groups dissolved and reformed in other corners. Socrates remained present, part of the scene, unobtrusive, yet not gone. Gradually, familiar faces appeared more often. More young people lingered longer. They did not come to hear a lecture. They came to test their own words, to see whether what they believed could withstand being questioned. In the Agora, that trial took place in public amid the most ordinary rhythms of life. Not everyone found this comfortable. In a city accustomed to speeches and persuasion, prolonging uncertainty was an unusual act. It did not lead to quick decisions. It did not help anyone win an argument. But it revealed the places where words rested more on habit than on understanding. During these same years, Socrates' life did not exist only in the square. Ancient sources tell us that he was married to Xanthippe and had 3 sons. Though the exact timing of his marriage and the births of his children is unclear, some later reconstructions suggest that he may have married after 423 BCE, with his eldest son, Lamprocles, born around 415 or 414 BCE. The conversations took place among citizens of every kind: merchants, craftsmen, young politicians, soldiers, newly returned from campaigns. Each carried different experiences, yet when they spoke about shared ideas, they often discovered they were less aligned than they had assumed. Justice in the courts was not the same as justice in war. Courage on the battlefield was different from courage in everyday life. Socrates did not offer replacement definitions. He allowed these differences to surface. He let them stand side by side, without forcing reconciliation. Here speech was not required to end in agreement. It was permitted to remain unfinished. After years of fatigue, the city began to grow used to this rhythm. Not all of Athens, but enough to create small pockets of stillness within the noise. Moments where people listened longer than usual, where questions lingered longer than answers. Socrates appeared regularly in these pockets of pause, not as a leader, not as an orator. He was more like a natural stopping point where words were set down before moving on. In a city trained to decide quickly, such a presence gradually became noticeable. It was also from this point that murmurs began to spread. Some said he confused the young. Some said he unsettled those who were confident in themselves. These remarks traveled slowly. They were not accusations, but they were enough for the name Socrates to be spoken more often than before. Stories began to move beyond the Agora. They were no longer about what Socrates had said, but about what others said about him. With each retelling, the image grew simpler. A man who asked too many questions. A man who confused the young. A man who offered no answers. Specific details faded. What remained was an impression that was easy to remember, easy to repeat. Socrates did not respond to these murmurs. He did not change the way he appeared. He did not seek more private spaces. He did not explain himself. He remained in the Agora amid shared routines, sunlight, stone dust, and overlapping voices. In these years, no major event was attached to his name. No texts were written. No school was founded. There were only conversations repeated day after day with different people, but at the same unhurried pace. And within that repetition, something began to take shape. Not a doctrine, but a habit. The habit of not rushing to believe what one has just said. The habit of returning to question the very words one uses. The habit of accepting that some questions do not end within a single conversation. Socrates left no mark carved in stone. He left no written page. His trace lay in the brief pauses between other people's sentences. Pauses that made no noise yet were difficult to erase. As the sun leaned westward, shadows from the columns stretched across the stone floor. Goods were packed away, groups dissolved. The Agora gradually emptied. Socrates departed as he had arrived, leaving no sign of an ending. Those footsteps would repeat for many years. And from those seemingly ordinary steps, a way of living slowly became familiar within the city. A way of living that placed questions before answers and was willing to remain longer with what was not yet clear. Chapter 7. A Question from Delphi. Delphi was a small town set on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, many days' journey from Athens, among steep stone paths and cooler air. It was not a center of trade nor a place of large population. People did not go to Delphi to settle there. They came to ask something important, and then they left. In the ancient Greek world, Delphi was believed to be the place where the god Apollo spoke to human beings through prophecy. There stood a great temple, a body of priests, and a strict ritual order. The oracle's words were delivered through the Pythia, the temple's priestess. Those who came to Delphi had to perform the proper rites, and only then were allowed to ask their question. The answers were usually brief, often difficult to interpret, and never accompanied by detailed instructions. Delphi held a unique position, not because of military power nor because of wealth, but because of the belief that here people could receive guidance when they could no longer decide on their own. City-states sent envoys before going to war. Families asked about marriage, inheritance, and illness. Individuals came when standing before an important crossroads. Delphi did not solve problems for them, but it allowed them to believe their questions had been placed in the right hands. Chaerephon was one such visitor. He was a close friend of Socrates, appearing frequently in the writings of Plato and Xenophon. In contrast to Socrates' measured manner, Chaerephon is described as impulsive, emotionally expressive, and inclined to act before fully considering the consequences. The two were different in temperament, yet closely bound. In Athenian life, Chaerephon belonged to a younger circle and was often seen beside Socrates during conversations in the Agora. It is unclear in which year Chaerephon went to Delphi. The sources only tell us that the event took place before the trial of 399 BCE. But by that time, Socrates was already a familiar figure in the city. He had friends, informal students, and also people who were irritated by his way of being. Chaerephon's question did not arise in a vacuum. It emerged at a moment when Socrates had begun to be spoken of as someone out of the ordinary. Before the temple of Apollo, Chaerephon asked a brief question. Was anyone wiser than Socrates? The answer from the oracle, as Socrates later recounts in the Apology, was just as brief. No one was wiser than Socrates. In the Greek world, such answers were rarely understood at face value. They were not simple praise, nor were they titles to be claimed. However one interpreted it, the response could not easily be dismissed. When Chaerephon carried it back to Athens, it was not proclaimed before a crowd. It circulated quietly among friends. For Socrates, the first response was not pride. In the accounts that survive, Socrates says plainly that he was perplexed. He did not believe that he possessed any special wisdom. He had no technical expertise. He did not teach. He did not write books. If the oracle's words were true, then that wisdom had to lie in something he did not yet understand. What matters here is not what the gods said, but how Socrates responded to it. He did not accept the answer as confirmation, nor did he dismiss it as meaningless. Instead, he treated it as a problem to be examined, not through ritual, but through the same conversations that already shaped his life. From that point on, according to his own account, Socrates began seeking out those who were considered wise in the city. Politicians who spoke regularly before the citizens. Poets whose creations were celebrated. Craftsmen who genuinely mastered their skills. He did not go to deny their worth, but to ask how well they understood what they spoke about. The result, as Socrates later described it, was not a victory. He did not prove himself superior to others. What he discovered was a gap. Many people knew a great deal within their own field, yet believed that this knowledge extended to all other matters as well. Confidence stretched beyond the limits of specific experience. If anything set Socrates apart in his own telling, it was that he did not conceal his lack of knowledge. He did not treat it as a flaw to be hidden. He allowed it to remain visible and began from there. The Delphic oracle, therefore, did not produce a new doctrine. It did not change how Socrates stood in the Agora. He still had no school, no platform. He charged no fees. But from this point forward, what he did carried an added frame of meaning that he himself recognized. Before Delphi, he asked questions as a way of living. After Delphi, he continued to ask questions, but with a sharper caution toward claims that sounded too certain, not to prove anything to others, but to avoid deceiving himself. Athens at this time had not yet entered its darkest phase. The war continued, but the city had not collapsed. Debates still took place. Young people still sought out Socrates. Yet from this moment on, amid the growing murmurs surrounding him, Delphi became a quiet point of reference. Not to shield him from public opinion, not to grant him authority, but to remind him of the limits of human knowledge. Delphi was not in Athens. Yet from here on it traveled back with Socrates to the square. Not present in everyday speech, but standing behind it, like a silent question about what human beings can know and what they should not pretend to know. If the Agora was where Socrates entered into dialogue with others, Delphi was where he first entered into dialogue with himself. Not in complete isolation, but amid relationships, rumors, and the misunderstandings beginning to gather around him. From this point onward, Socrates' footsteps remained as unhurried as before. But they were no longer entirely unreflective. They carried a clearer self-awareness of what he was doing and why he continued to do it, even as the city began to look at him through different eyes. Chapter 8. A Life Without Written Pages. In Athens, words usually left traces. A speech was copied down. A decision was entered into the records. An important opinion was preserved through writing. This was a city accustomed to keeping words so they could be used again later. Socrates left nothing of that kind. There were no texts bearing his name, no recorded lectures, no doctrines are arranged into sections. What he said existed only in the moment of conversation, then dissolved back into the crowd. The next day, in the Agora, people remembered it only in their own way. At first, this drew little notice. For many years, Athens was used to Socrates' presence as part of everyday life. People encountered him, spoke with him, and moved on. No one thought to record what had just happened. No one saw it as necessary. But gradually, as his name was spoken more often, the absence of anything to consult began to have clearer consequences. Stories about Socrates started to spread beyond the Agora. They were no longer specific dialogues, but scattered anecdotes. In Athens, such stories were often told at the end of the day when people were tired and less patient with details. A man who asked too many questions. A man who confused others. A man who never offered clear answers. With each retelling, the image grew simpler. Details fell away. What remained was an impression. because there were no texts to compare against. Nothing held these stories in place. They changed with the teller, with mood, with irritation or admiration. Socrates could not control this, and he did not try to. In a city trained in rhetoric and persuasion, leaving no fixed words behind was unusual. It forced others to interpret. And when people must interpret, they often follow what they already believe. For the young who regularly stopped to listen to Socrates, he was someone who opened new spaces for thought. But for those who heard only second-hand accounts, he could easily become an irritating figure. Someone who disrupted what seemed settled. Someone who asked questions where no questions were needed. This difference did not arise from a single event. It formed slowly over time, through repeated mentions of his name, through stories that went unchecked, through the absence of any text that could say he said this in this situation with this meaning. Socrates did not intervene in this process. He did not write to explain himself. He did not gather followers to fix a single interpretation. He did not offer a summary of what he believed to be true. His life continued as before in direct conversation with particular people. But Athens was not shaped only by face-to-face conversations. It was also shaped by public opinion, by collective memory, by what was repeated when those involved were no longer present. At that level of city life, Socrates was increasingly absent in the way he would have wished. There were no written pages to stand between him and misunderstanding. No texts to soften the distortion. This allowed the image of Socrates to shift in ways that did not favor him. It could be exaggerated, simplified, or loaded with meanings he had never expressed. In these years, Athens was still weary from war. The city's patience was not what it once had been. Anything that slowed decision-making was easily seen as an obstacle. Questions that did not quickly lead to action were easily dismissed as pointless. In such a climate, a man who did not write, did not conclude, and did not offer clear solutions became more irritating than before. Not because he had changed, but because the city had. Socrates continued to live as he always had, seeing no need to correct the absence of written pages. For him, knowledge only mattered when tested in living dialogue. But society does not run only on what is present. It also runs on what is retold when someone is no longer there. From this point on, the distance between Socrates as he understood himself and Socrates as the city imagined him began to widen. Not loudly, not suddenly, but clearly enough that later, when accusations emerged, there would be no text to return to, no page to ask what he had actually said. A life without written pages at this moment was not yet a tragic choice, but it had created a space. And within that space, others began to speak in his place. Chapter 9. The City's Shadow. In the spring of 404 BCE, the Peloponnesian War came to an end. After nearly 30 years of intermittent conflict, the city finally had to accept defeat at the hands of Sparta. It was not a defeat that unfolded in a single day, but an exhaustion that had accumulated over many years. It settled in gradually, like a body worn down by long strain. The roads leading to the city gates were no longer as crowded as before. Market stalls opened later. Sellers spoke less, and buyers did not linger. On the familiar stone steps where people once stopped to debate public affairs, only a few small groups now stood scattered, speaking in lowered voices. The city walls began to be dismantled. Stones that had once been raised to protect Athens were taken down piece by piece. There was no public protest. People watched and then turned away. At the port of Piraeus, the familiar rhythm of life had vanished. Ships that once sailed now lie still. Oars were stacked. Sails were rolled and tied. No one spoke of departure days. No one asked when a ship would leave the harbor again. Athens was not destroyed outright, but it was deliberately weakened. Self-rule, once the city's greatest pride, was placed under the close supervision of the victor. Sparta did not govern Athens directly. Instead, it supported a pro-Spartan regime known as the 30. 30 men were granted authority to reorganize the city's political order. In name, it was an effort to restore stability. In practice, it quickly became a rule based on fear. Citizen lists were reviewed. Those deemed unreliable were removed from political life. The property was confiscated. Arrests took place without public trials. The streets of Athens were still busy, but voices were lower than before. People learned to speak softly and, more importantly, learned when not to speak. Evening seemed to arrive earlier. Many doors closed before nightfall. Oil lamps cast light from sealed homes bright enough for a quick meal, then were extinguished early. The Agora was still there, but it was no longer a natural place to stop and talk. Extended exchanges became rare. Eyes glanced around more often before a question was asked. The city, once accustomed to speaking everything aloud, in public, began to learn the habit of holding things back. In that climate, Socrates' old habits felt more out of place than ever. He did not make the 30 tyrants his central topic. He did not deliver speeches against them. Yet he continued to appear in public spaces, continued to stop and talk, and continued to ask slow questions that did not aim at quick decisions. In a city under surveillance, continuing to speak openly, continuing to question ideas such as justice, duty, and power, became a sensitive act. The contrast did not erupt into open conflict at once. It settled instead into a low, persistent tension, a sense that some people had not fully accepted the way the city was now being run. It was during this period that an order was issued. Socrates, along with several other citizens, was instructed to arrest Leon of Salamis. No explanation was given. In that context, being named was explanation enough. Those who received the order gathered. There was no debate. No one asked questions. The familiar streets of Athens lay before them as on any other day. Houses stood as usual. Shops remained open. But eyes turned away more often. No one wanted to know where they were going. Socrates walked with them for a time. Then he stopped. He did not call on others to follow his example. He simply turned back and went home. The others continued on. Leon was arrested and later executed, like many during that period. There is no record that Socrates was punished for this act, perhaps because he made no display of it. Perhaps because the 30 had too much else to control at the time. The ancient sources do not say. But his turning back did not go unnoticed. In a city where many had learned to comply in order to survive, that act was remembered. Not as a rebellion, but as a misalignment. One man who did not continue when continuing was the safer path. During this time, many Athenians chose silence as a means of survival. They avoided long conversations, avoided topics that might draw attention, avoided even those who might pull them into trouble. Some young people still sought out Socrates, but less openly than before. Conversations moved to the margins, no longer at the center. The city's shadow lay not only in what was forbidden, but in what could no longer be said naturally. By 403 BCE, the regime of the 30 tyrants collapsed. Democracy was restored after a brief civil conflict. Athens tried to mend itself. An amnesty was declared intended to close the past and prevent prolonged political revenge. On paper, the city returned to its old principles. But cracks did not vanish easily. Fear lingered in memory. Suspicion remained in how people looked at one another. Years of rule by violence left marks deeper than law alone could erase. Socrates emerged from this period without power and without charges. But he did not return to the same place he had occupied before the war. The city had learned to see him through many layers. A man who asked too many questions. A man who was unsettling. A man who had once refused to follow an order when many others had obeyed. The shadow had passed, but it left behind a harsher light. The light of a city trying to understand itself again after seeing what happens when power goes unchallenged. In that light, Socrates' questions were still there. They became clearer and at the same time more dangerous. Athens began to look back on the years just lived through. And in that process, the city's familiar faces were gradually re-examined through different eyes. Who had contributed to stability? Who had caused the disruption? Who should be listened to, and who in the end needed to be brought before the public to answer for the things the city was no longer sure about? The city's shadow had receded. But in the brightness that followed, questions about Socrates began to be asked in a different way. Chapter 10. The Accusations. In the early days of 399 BCE, Athens returned to the rhythm of a city trying to mend itself. On paper, democracy had long been restored. Assemblies met again. Courts sat again. Debates resumed. Yet in daily life, many things did not return as they once were. Conversation still took place in the Agora, but words were chosen more carefully. Certain names were spoken a little more softly. Certain memories passed through conversations and were set aside as if they had never existed. Socrates was still there. He remained present in the city in much the same way as in the years before. No school, no lectures, no writing boards, no texts. His conversation then still unfolded in places where everyone could see them. And for that reason, he remained part of Athens, even as Athens had changed its skin and its pace. But in a city that had just endured years of fear and civil conflict, even the familiar could become a burden. People began to look back at what had exhausted them, what had kept them awake at night, what had changed the tone of their sons' voices, what had turned ordinary conversation into an argument. And the name Socrates lay within that space. Not simply because he asked many questions. Athens was accustomed to questioning. Not simply because he spoke in public. Athens lived by words. The discomfort lay elsewhere. Socrates' questions did not help people move quickly toward decisions. They made people stop. And when a city has suffered loss, people often want to move on, to close things off, to stabilize. Stopping for too long can come to seem useless or dangerous. The stories about him, which had circulated for many years, did not fade with time. They changed shape. They acquired new layers. The teller no longer needed to recall a specific dialogue. It was enough to recall a feeling. A man who unsettled others. A man who encouraged the young to argue. A man who had once felt solid is suddenly uncertain. At a certain point, public opinion was no longer just rumor. It began to look for a way into the city's machinery. Athens had a familiar habit. When something remained uncomfortable for long enough, people wanted to place it into law, to bring it into court, to obtain an official answer so the city could continue. The accusations against Socrates emerged at that moment. 3 names are preserved in the tradition surrounding this case: Miletus, Anytus, and Lycon. Each represented a different social network within Athens. Miletus is usually mentioned as the formal author of the indictment. Anytus was a more influential figure connected to political life and firmly established as a citizen. Lycon, as the ancient sources recount, was associated with the world of oratory. To listeners today, these names may sound unfamiliar. But in Athens at the time, they signaled that this was not merely a personal quarrel. It was a step taken within the city's institutional structure. The charges were framed in familiar terms, serious enough, broad enough, and clear enough for many to nod along. Socrates was accused of not honoring the gods that the city honored, of introducing new religious practices, and of corrupting the youth. These words did not require a single specific act to be immediately proven. They functioned more like a net. Those already uneasy could find something to catch on to. Those already anxious would find them plausible. In post-war Athens, after tyranny, anxiety spread easily. Religion in Athens was not a private matter. It was bound to festivals, oaths, public rituals, and the belief that the city remained under divine protection. When someone was said to be impious, people did not hear only a question of belief. They heard a sign of instability, a deviation from the shared order. The charge of corrupting the youth was particularly effective among families worn down by years of upheaval. In Athens, adults had watched generations of young men pass through war coups and the rule of the 30 tyrants. Some had stood close to centers of power and then disappeared. Some returned with different eyes. In that context, any influence on the young could easily become a sensitive issue. Socrates had young people around him, even if he did not call them students. Some lingered with him for years. Some carried his way of questioning back home to the dinner table to the workplace. For some families, this was simply a habit of debate. For others, it was a sign of disrespect. When a child began to question his father, to no longer accept what elders said at once, people looked for a cause. And in Athens, that cause was sometimes given a name. It was at this point that the old image from the stage returned like a faint shadow. Years earlier, Aristophanes had placed the name Socrates on the stage in The Clouds. That image did not need to be accurate to be effective. It planted a face in the city's collective memory. A man who spoke strangely, a man who toyed with reasoning, a man who taught how to win with words. Even if the real Socrates did not fully match that portrayal, the image endured. And in times of instability, collective memory often simplifies what it holds on to. When an accusation is written, it does not begin from nothing. It attaches itself to impressions that already exist, to stories once told, to discomfort once felt, to memories that were never entirely clear. And so the name Socrates moved from conversation into a file. In daily life, this did not unfold like an explosion. It happened as a subtle shift in how people looked at him. Some who once stopped to listen now walked past more quickly. Some conversations ended sooner. Some nods disappeared. Not everyone turned away, but enough that he could sense the city adjusting its rhythm away from him. There is no record that Socrates tried to campaign to reconcile or to soften public opinion before the trial. He had no texts to explain himself, no private forum to retell the story on his own terms. He continued to live through direct speech, which meant he could only respond when facing someone in person. The accusation did not wait for such encounters. It followed the path of law. Once the charges were formally filed, Athens did what Athens always did. The city prepared a public trial. Citizens would gather, listen, and vote. Not a small group deciding behind closed doors, but the crowd in the political sense of the city. Before the day of the trial, Athens went on living. The market still opened. Hearths still burned. People still bought bread, bought oil, exchanged news. Yet threaded through these routines, word of the trial spread quickly. A trial not only judges a man, but also judges a habit that has long been woven into the city. For many, it was a chance to put an end to a lingering irritation. For others, it was unsettling because it showed that the city could use law to bind a certain way of speaking. Socrates continued to walk through Athens as he always had. But now, each step felt closer to a place different from the Agora. A place where he could not ask questions to prolong the exchange on his own terms. A place where the city would question him in the city's way. And when the morning of the trial arrived, he would have to stand before the crowd, not to ask questions, but to speak once fully about how he had lived among them. Chapter 11. Before the Court of Athens. Sunlight fell across the stone steps of the court, revealing the worn marks left by generations of feet. This was not an unfamiliar space to the citizens. It was where they had sat for hours to hear arguments, cast votes, and decide the fate of others. But today, the rhythm felt slower. The Athenian court was not an enclosed chamber. It stood open to the sky. There were no high walls separating judges from the accused. Citizens sat in long rows. They came not only to decide, but to witness. Here, justice was a public act carried out in full daylight. Socrates entered this space as he entered the Agora, without haste, without gestures meant to seek sympathy. He dressed no differently. He carried nothing meant to impress. Before him sat the men who would vote on his fate. Yet his pace did not change. The charges were read aloud. There was nothing new in them compared to what the city had been whispering for years, failing to honor the gods in the customary way, introducing new divine beings, corrupting the youth. Concepts broad enough that anyone could nod along in his own way. When it was his turn to speak, Socrates did not begin with pleas. He did not speak of his family. He did not mention his age. He did not try to prove that he was harmless. He spoke as he had always spoken in the square. Slowly, clearly, without ornament. He did not deny that he asked questions, nor did he promise to stop. Instead, he asked those listening to examine the charges themselves. What does it mean to corrupt? What does it mean to be impious? Who has been harmed, and in what way? In a space accustomed to forceful rhetoric, this way of speaking created a different rhythm. There was no climax, no slogans. His questions were not meant to defeat an opponent, but to clarify what was being said. Socrates referred to the oracle at Delphi, not as a defense, but as a point of departure. If anything set him apart, he said it was that he did not believe he knew more than others. If his wisdom existed at all, it lay in knowing that he did not know. Before an assembly of citizens, this was an unsettling argument. It did not strike directly. It did not allow listeners to easily take sides. It forced them to ask themselves what they were voting for. Socrates did not shy away from that discomfort. He did not adjust his words to soothe the crowd. When it was suggested that a softer tone might help him, he did not change. Not out of defiance, but because he did not know how to speak otherwise. He did not beg for mercy. He did not propose a lighter penalty as a bargain. When asked to suggest a punishment for himself, he did not try to diminish what he had said. His answer was not meant to provoke, but neither was it meant to please. In that moment, the distance between him and the city became clear. Not a distance of hostility, but of differing tempos. The city wanted a conclusion. Socrates continued to ask open questions. He stood there unchanged in bearing. He had said what he could say in the way he had always spoken. From here on, what would happen no longer depended on whether he was right or wrong, but on how far the city was willing to live alongside this way of speaking. Sunlight still fell on the stone floor of the court. Citizens waited, and Athens in that brief moment prepared to make a decision whose consequences would stay with the city for a long time to come. Chapter 12. The door closes. The decision came quickly in the familiar rhythm of the city. There was no long pause for reconsideration. In Athens, judgment was part of civic life, and once the speaking ended, the verdict followed in full daylight. Socrates was found guilty. The margin was not large. It was not an overwhelming consensus, but it was enough to open the door to the next stage. In Athens, after guilt was established, the defendant was given one more chance to propose an alternative penalty. This was the moment many expected him to change his tone, to ask for leniency, to mention his age, his family, his years of service to the city as a soldier. Socrates did not do this. He stood before the jury and spoke slowly, as he always had in the Agora, not to challenge and not to soothe. He did not accept that he had done wrong, and so he could not propose a punishment that implied an admission of guilt. At one point he mentioned that he deserved to be maintained at the Prytaneum, the place reserved for citizens who had served the city, not as loud sarcasm, but as a way of pointing to the mismatch between what he had done and how the city was now naming it. In that space, the silence grew heavier. Not everyone was outraged. Some were confused. Some were irritated. Some began to realize that this trial was not following a familiar script. In Athens, speech was often a tool for turning decisions. Here, speech was being used to hold a position. In the end, the penalty was pronounced death by poison. There was no great noise when the sentence was read. No chaos. Everything unfolded like a procedure already known. People stood, people left. The trial ended. The city returned to its ordinary rhythm as if a necessary task had been completed. Socrates was not taken away at once. Under Athenian law, the execution had to wait until the sacred ship returned from Delos. During that time, he was held in custody, but not under harsh conditions. Friends were allowed to visit. Conversations continued, but no longer in the square. They took place in a narrower space where light entered through a small window. In the first days after the verdict, a proposal was made. Socrates' friends, those with means and connections, were ready to arrange his escape. It was not an uncommon act in the Greek world. Many had done the same when faced with an unjust sentence. The route had been planned. Money was not an obstacle. Possible places of refuge were named. Socrates listened. He did not interrupt. He did not respond at once. Then he answered in that same unhurried voice. He said that escaping was not simply leaving a prison. It meant turning away from the laws that had shaped the city in which he had lived his entire life. He asked in return whether someone who benefits from the law when it protects him can reject it when the law turns against him, not as a complex legal argument, but as a question of how to live consistently. For those sitting in the room, it was a difficult moment to accept. Not because they failed to understand the reasoning, but because they understood its cost. To flee was to live. To remain was to die. The choice stood with a clarity rarely found in ordinary life. Socrates did not say that death was good. He did not say that it was not frightening. He said only that there were certain things which, if abandoned, would leave a life that was no longer the life he had chosen to live. In his words, there was no call for sacrifice, only a refusal to betray himself at the final moment. The conversations in those days no longer carried the sharp edge of inquiry. They were heavier, slower. At times they paused for long stretches. People spoke about the soul, about living well, about what gives a human life meaning. Not to arrive at final answers, but to remain with those questions a little longer. Outside, Athens went on with its routines. The market remained open. Assemblies continued to meet. Children played along the stone paths. The city did not stop for one man. Yet in a small corner of it, time seemed to draw inward, waiting for a ritual to conclude. The door closed, not with a loud sound, but with quiet acceptance. Not the acceptance of the city, but of the man who had been condemned. Socrates did not leave the courtroom as a victor, nor did he enter the prison as a pleading victim. He stepped into the final phase of his life with the same rhythm he had kept for years, unhurried, unavoiding, unwilling to change his voice to suit the moment. From that moment on, what remained was no longer in his hands. Time law and the city would decide the ending. And Socrates in that small room had only one thing left to do, the one thing he had always done well: to stay with his questions until there was no more time to ask them. Chapter 13. The Days of Waiting. Time around Socrates slowed. Not because the city stopped. Athens still woke each morning. The market still opened. Citizens still moved in and out of the Agora. Only his own rhythm separated from that flow like a still pool within a moving river. The prison was not dark. Daylight entered through a high window sliding along the stone walls. In the morning, the light was thin and cool. At midday, it lingered briefly, then withdrew. In the afternoon, shadows stretched longer across the floor. The pattern repeated each day. Socrates lived those days much as he had lived before. He ate simply, slept when night fell, woke when light touched the room. There were no heavy chains, no shouted orders, only footsteps passing the door and long intervals of silence. Friends were allowed to visit. They came one by one quietly. Plato was present on some occasions. Crito came more often. Younger men who had once stood beside him in the Agora now sat silently in the small room, speaking less than they once had. Conversations continued, but they were no longer the same. There was no testing. No probing meant to expose contradiction. The questions turned inward. People spoke of the soul, of death, of whether living rightly still mattered when the ending was already known. Socrates did not try to soften their unease. He did not say that death was easy, nor did he say it was more terrifying than imagined. He simply kept the conversation honest, leaving his lack of knowledge visible even in the face of what was coming. There were very long silences. No one hurried to fill them. They were no longer a technique of dialogue as in the Agora. They were the natural result of there being nothing left to prove. Once more, the suggestion of escape was raised. Not as a detailed plan, but as a final question. Was there still another way? Socrates listened. Then he shook his head. Not because he did not love life, but because he could not accept living by denying everything he had said throughout his life. For him, consistency was not an abstract principle. It was bound to how one treats the law, the city, and oneself. Outside the prison, summer arrived slowly. Stone along the roads held the day's heat long after sunset. At Piraeus, the sea was calm. Few ships set sail. The city, after so many upheavals, rested in a state of prolonged fatigue. No one counted down the days. There was no ritual of preparation. Time did not move toward a climax. It flowed evenly day after day, as if waiting for something inevitable. Those who left the small room did not depart in panic. But neither were they lightened. They carried with them a strange feeling that death, when faced directly, does not have to become dramatic. It can be present as part of life itself, not separate from the questions that had already been asked. Socrates did not write down what he said during those days. There was no formal farewell. Only the memories of those who sat in that small room listening as he spoke slowly, paused, and then spoke again. As the light in the prison shifted each day, conversations ended earlier. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because people gradually understood that time no longer needed to be filled. The days of waiting did not change the sentence, but they clarified one thing. For Socrates, philosophy did not exist only in moments of debate. It was also present in the act of waiting, in remaining with an ending already known, without trying to avoid it or reshape it into something else. When that time came to an end, there was no warning. Only another morning light once again touching the stone floor and a familiar ritual of the city beginning. Chapter 14. The Final Cup. That morning arrived like any other. Light slipped into the small room and touched the cool stone floor. There was no bell, no announcement. Only a slight change in the air, enough for those present to sense that the waiting had ended. The sacred ship had returned. Under Athenian law, there was no longer any reason for delay. The ritual resumed not out of hatred or haste, but because the order of the city required it to proceed. The jailers entered with a familiar manner. Not heavy, not cold, simply carrying out a task already decided. The cup was brought in. Hemlock was not an unfamiliar substance in Athenian life. It was used as a means of execution because its effects were known and relatively swift. There were no instruments of torture, no crowd, no stage. Only a cloudy liquid with a faint sharp smell was delivered at the appointed time. The friends present stood closer together. No one raised their voice. No one wept aloud. Not because there was no pain, but because the moment did not allow for noise. Socrates looked at them one by one. His gaze did not turn away, nor did it try to console. He was simply present as he had been for so many years. Someone's hand trembled while holding the cup. The man who handed it to Socrates lowered his head and spoke quietly, saying that he did this against his will. Socrates replied with a short sentence, almost familiar in tone. No reproach, no defense, just a reminder that each person was doing the part assigned to him. He took the cup, looked into it for a brief moment. Not as a ritual, not as a test. Simply looked and then drank. There was no prolonged hesitation, no final speech. He drank decisively, as if completing a task that needed to be done, not stepping into a moment meant to be remembered. Then he set the cup down. The jailer instructed him to walk about the room so the poison would spread more quickly through his body. Socrates obeyed. His steps were slow and even. No haste, no strain. Each step felt like part of the same rhythm of life still continuing. The poison began to take effect from the feet upward. A growing heaviness, then numbness. The jailer checked, touching lightly, asking whether sensation remained. Socrates answered clearly, without panic. Short, precise replies, as he had answered questions in the Agora. When the sensation reached his chest, he lay down. His friends gathered around him. Some could not hold back their tears. Some turned away. Some stood still, as if there were nowhere else to place their gaze. Socrates spoke once more, the last sentence recorded. He reminded Crito that they owed a rooster to Asclepius and that it should not be forgotten. Not a complex metaphor, not a prophecy, just a reminder of a small debt like those of everyday life. The sentence did not soften the atmosphere. It clarified what was happening. Death for Socrates was not a staged tragedy. It was part of an order, like an illness that requires healing, like a debt that must be paid. After that, he fell silent. His breathing slowed. His chest no longer rose. The jailer placed a hand over his heart, then nodded. It was finished. There was no cry. No sudden movement, only the stopping of a rhythm that had once been deeply familiar. Outside Athens continued its life. Sunlight still fell on the stone roads. Merchants still arranged their stalls. Children still ran through narrow passages. The city did not pause to mark this moment. Inside the small room, those who remained stood still for a while longer. No one spoke at once, not because there was nothing to say, but because any words would have been too much. Socrates did not leave behind a shocking scene. He did not offer a final act of defiance. He departed from the life of the city in a way that matched how he had lived within it. Without drama, without evasion, without trying to control how others would remember him. His death did not cause Athens to collapse, nor did it immediately change how the city functioned. But it left behind a quiet absence, a space where a familiar voice no longer appeared. No one stood in the Agora that afternoon to replace him. There was no successor, no ritual of transfer, only conversations that ended more quickly, pauses that lasted longer. The cup was empty, but the questions were not. Socrates was no longer there to ask them. Yet the way he had lived, spoken, and departed allowed them to remain in the city, not as a doctrine, not as a sealed legacy, but it is a habit difficult to abandon. The habit of stopping before believing that one already knows enough. In a city that once condemned him for this, that very habit would continue to live on quietly, through those who had sat beside him in the small room and through those who would hear this story many years later. Chapter 15. Those who remained. The death of Socrates did not close the city. Athens did not stop to mourn for long. The market stayed open. Citizen assemblies continued to meet. Other trials were brought before the public square. The city was accustomed to letting great events pass and then adjusting itself as it had after war, after violence, after changes of regime. But for those who had sat in the small room that day, death did not end with the ritual. They left the prison in silence. No one spoke loudly. No one lingered for long. Each took a different path, carrying with them the memory of those final hours, the slow voice, the long pauses, an ending without drama. These were not easy to recount fully, nor were they easy to forget. Among those who remained, Plato was the youngest and also the one who carried the heaviest sense of incompletion. He was not present at the final moment by his own account. Yet that absence did not weaken the story. Instead, it created a space that Plato would spend the rest of his life filling with writing. Plato did not write a biography in the usual sense. He did not arrange Socrates' life into a sequence of events. He wrote dialogues. He let Socrates speak, ask, challenge, and sometimes fall silent. In doing so, Socrates did not become a figure of the past, but continued to live in speech. Not as a monument, but as a familiar voice that appears at just the right moment to slow an argument that is moving too quickly. Xenophon took a different path. Less philosophical, more direct, he emphasized character and integrity in everyday life. Xenophon's Socrates is not especially mysterious. He appears as a moral teacher, simple, consistent. The two images do not fully align, yet their differences show that Socrates was seen from multiple angles from the very beginning. None of them claimed to be his successor. No Socratic school was established immediately after his death. No doctrine bore his name. Those who had once gathered around him in the Agora dispersed each in a different direction. Some continued to ask questions. Some returned to private life. Some chose silence. In the city, the name Socrates began to change its tone. For some, he was a troublemaker who had been removed. For others, he was a victim of collective fear. There was no clear consensus. Yet the name did not disappear. It surfaced in later conversations when people spoke of the trial of the young, of freedom of speech, of the boundary between questioning and disturbing order. What is striking is this: Socrates left no instructions on how he should be remembered. He did not ask to be vindicated. He left no final testament. What remained depended entirely on how others chose to tell the story and how they chose to preserve or distort that voice. For this reason, Socrates gradually became an open figure, unfixed, unsettled, at times a philosopher, at times a sophist, at times a martyr for freedom of thought, at times simply a man who had asked too many questions in a tired city. Those who remained did not carry a complete legacy. They carried fragments, unfinished dialogues, questions without answers. And from those fragments, each continued in his own way. Athens, for its part, did not erect a statue to Socrates right away. There was no official commemoration, but neither was he erased from the city's memory. His name continued to be spoken, sometimes with irritation, sometimes with regret. The presence was not loud, but it endured. Socrates left no writings, yet that very absence kept him from being fixed in place. What he said did not lie still on a page. It continued to be spoken again, revised, challenged, and reinterpreted, not as a system, but as a lasting provocation. Those who remained did not keep him as an answer. They kept him as a question, one that had been asked once and never allowed to close. And from there, Socrates began to live another life. No longer walking on the stone paths of the Agora, but present in those moments when people pause, doubt what they are about to say, and ask themselves whether they truly know. That is how he remained. Quietly, incompletely, but long enough to continue slowing the rhythm of anyone willing to stop and listen. Chapter 16. The square remains. The Agora did not disappear with Socrates. The stone steps are still there, worn further by time. Columns still cast their shadows on the ground at midday. People still pass through, still pause, still argue for new reasons. The city has changed. Regimes changed laws and even changed the way it remembers its past. Yet the square is a place where people meet through words, continues to exist. There is no marker showing where Socrates once stood. No one knows exactly which corner he favored. His conversations left no physical trace. They dissolved into the air the moment they ended. Yet the fact that they once took place is not easily erased. In the years after his death, Athens learned to live with that memory in different ways. Some avoided mentioning it. Some recalled it with caution. Some, especially the younger, heard of him as something both distant and familiar. A man who asked questions that made others uncomfortable. A man who paid a price for refusing to speak differently. Over time, Socrates came to belong not only to Athens. He stepped beyond the specific context of the trial of 399 BCE to become a broader problem. Not a problem of guilt or innocence, but of how human beings face their own not knowing. How much a society can tolerate questions that do not lead to quick answers. Those who later read Plato did not read only about a man. They encountered a mode of presence, someone who did not teach in the usual sense, who did not offer a complete doctrine, who did not promise final conclusions, who simply persisted in asking again what seemed already clear. For this reason, Socrates is often called the beginning of Western philosophy. Yet if one looks closely, he did not leave a clear starting point. He left a habit, the habit of stopping in the middle of life's flow. The habit of not rushing to agree with oneself. The habit of accepting that some things matter more than appearing knowledgeable. The Agora, in that sense, is not only a historical site. It is an image of an open space, where words are placed before the public, where questions can be heard, and where uncertainty is not immediately treated as failure. Each era may have its own square, but that spirit does not arise on its own. It has to be preserved, or at least remembered. The death of Socrates is often told as a tragedy, but if the story ends there, it closes too soon. What matters more is this: after he died, his questions did not die with him. They were not decisively answered, nor were they completely dismissed. They continued to unsettle in quieter ways. Across centuries, people have argued about Socrates. Was he genuinely humble, or only pretending not to know? Did he liberate people or confuse them? Was he a victim of democracy or its inevitable outcome? These debates never truly end, and perhaps that is exactly what suits his legacy. Socrates did not leave behind a path to follow. He left a space that each person must step into alone. A space without ready-made answers, but one that does not allow indifference. The square remains not only in Athens, but wherever people gather to speak about what they share. Their questions can still be heard sometimes, drowned out, sometimes ignored, but never entirely gone. And if there is one thing that remains most clearly from the life of Socrates, it is not a conclusion. It is a quiet reminder that a city, a community, or human life is measured not only by what it affirms, but also by the questions it dares to keep. Socrates left the square long ago, but the square is a place where questions may be asked before they are answered has not yet closed. Centuries passed. The world changed faster than the stone paths of Athens once wore down beneath his feet. Schools appeared. Books grew thicker. His name was printed on covers, taught in classrooms, and quoted endlessly. Questions once spoken aloud in the square now sit neatly inside curricula. Organized, labeled. There is a quiet paradox here. A man who wrote nothing became one of the most written about figures in history. A man wary of sealed knowledge was turned into a symbol of philosophy. Those who were once irritated by him are long gone. Yet it was that very resistance that allowed him to outlive any formal defense. In today's world where answers are expected quickly and opinions must be clear and immediate, his spirit can feel like an uncomfortable delay. And yet for that very reason, it has never fully disappeared. Every time someone pauses in the middle of a confident claim, every time a question is held longer than its answer, there that legacy breathes again. Perhaps this is how people like him endure. Not through victory, not through conclusions, but through stories that continue to be told, each time slightly changed. And now as the night grows deeper, let the light soften. Let this story settle. He no longer speaks. But somewhere within very small silences, sleep carries with it a legacy that has not yet closed.